All right, Dave.
Welcome back
So,
to another.
oh, you
Oh,
do
you're
it.
gonna kick it
No, you're
off.
gonna do
Okay,
it.
let's do
Go
it. No,
ahead.
you do it. What? You have to put this as the blooper reel up front. Welcome to another episode of the H3X Podcast with Mark Gearing and Dave Miller. And today we want to talk more about what we always talk about: the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. And today we have got a tool that Mark has kind of developed for vision casting and tracking all at the same time that we started using in Oklahoma City, and I felt has been very, very helpful from the very beginning. But it's really focused around the conversation of how do we find the unreached peoples in our cities? Who are they? What do they look like? How do we begin to focus in on them? And then how do we let other people know what is left so that we can actually get to the no place left concept in our urban context? Does that sound like a decent setup, Mark?
Oh, that sounds great. This is why I love doing this with you, Dave. Is like I feel like there's so many pieces in the way that I think and approach this that are just gaps, and I just rely on you to help fill in those gaps. So yeah, you do a great job. So I pushed him into that to helping set it up today. It's important that we understand what our end state is, what we're like trying to get to, so that we can know where we are and how we're doing and what to focus on and all those pieces. And so we're going to get to this tool here in a second, but would you mind just setting us up with what does that even mean to be focused on unreached peoples, and how are we thinking about that as the vision cast and the goal?
So going back to the 5 T's that we've talked about multiple times on this podcast, and even we keep referring people back to that series with the target, tools, teaming, training, and tracking. We really recognize that target and tracking was the biggest weakness that we had, that it was the area that we needed to grow in the most in terms of where we are and what we're doing, especially in Oklahoma City. And so when you start thinking about the target, that's pretty easy. People start going, well, who hasn't heard the gospel? Well, that's a pretty easy question to ask. But whenever you start really digging into our cities, for us, a Western urban context, who hasn't heard the gospel, oftentimes those people are hidden. And the reason that they haven't heard the gospel is because we don't know that they exist. There's pockets in our city that are there. So, the concept of unreached peoples, if y'all wanted to look it up and really kind of get a good feel for it, you should Google Ralph Winter's article from the Perspectives books, Finishing the Task, the Unreached People's Challenge, where Ralph Winter really introduced the concept that we now call, unreached peoples or unreached, unengaged people groups. Yeah. And it was the idea very simply of Pontata Ethne in the Great Commission, meaning the nations, where he began to say, traditionally, we thought about it very geographically, especially in the early 20th century. And as the middle of the 20th century hit and they started moving into what's left, how do we accomplish the Great Commission? He began to challenge the idea of nation state geographic type thinking. And he began to go, okay, well, where's the barriers to the gospel based upon language, based upon culture, based upon peoples? Because you could go into a nation state and say, okay, everybody in that, let's say India, there's hundreds of millions of people that speak Hindi, but just because we speak Hindi and live in India doesn't mean that the gospel is naturally going to spread. And so the big question that really began to define the people group concept that Ralph Winter was trying to get across, and I think did a really good job of it to push us forward, is to ask, how far can the gospel go naturally in the flow of a community or in a segment of people before it reaches a barrier and it halts for whatever reason, and it must make a cross-cultural jump at that point, and there has to be more intentionality in order for that to happen. And Mark and I have been talking a ton, and where traditionally unreached people groups for the longest time have really taken on the form of an ethnicity or a language group or a religion group and some combination of those. You might even go back to our target conversation with Bud Houston as we talked about EarlPeg, right? Where we're talking about the language, the religion, the geographic region, the urban center that they're in, those concepts. But Mark and I have really began to push into, okay, even within the fact that we might have a unreached people group worldwide that is, say, Gujarat, that we talked about just a couple of podcasts ago, right? The Gujarats that are in New Jersey are a different people group and a different segment than the ones who are actually living in South Asia. But even then, within the Gujarats that are in New Jersey, you have some that may have been here for years, or some here may have been here just recently for months. And that starts to really make a difference on how you look at those. And so to narrow it all down, we're simply saying, where do we see the gospel stopping in our cities? Asking the question, why is it stopping? And then if there is an intentional barrier that needs to be broken, then see that as a segment, a people group that we need to target and go after, so that the gospel can have a church planted among that group.
So that that frames up the task that we have in front of us. You did such a great job sharing that, Dave. And so out of facing that task around the world, different people have had different understandings of what is unreached and how are we doing in that progress. And so in that conversation, this idea of phases of engagement has emerged. And so I'll put that up here on the screen for those that are watching this. And so these phases have helped to unpack the progress in engaging those unreached people group, or that segment within a city, as Dave's highlighting. And even as we talked about in a recent episode here, towards getting local owners of that core task that we define as, we look for as a church that is owning that.
Right.
So that's the middle phase, phase 4. So really just quickly, phase 1, adoption. There's going to be a team that's willing to adopt that. Phase 2 is gospel, where there's reports of the workers sharing the gospel within that group. And specifically, because there's a lot of different people out there sharing the gospel, was specifically with the intention of church planting and towards multiplication. So that's really what we're trying to attract. There's a lot of, it starts to get kind of fuzzy because we live in a place where there's a lot of different ideas about church, but we're specifically trying to track the multiplying church. And so then believers, and we're looking for those that are responding within that people group, specifically through obedience and defined as baptism, towards local church. So that's phase 4, where there's an indigenous local church. And then phase 5, that church now reproducing, because we understand, hey, if we're going to actually get this task done, it's going to take multiplication. God's a God of multiplication. And so at every level, including church, phase 5, we're going to see those churches beginning to reproduce, and then actually beginning to get to multiplication, phase 6, where that's moving beyond a first generation. And then finally, phase 7, where that hits a tipping point of 10% in that target segment. And maybe that's also maybe several networks emerging within that people group. So that kind of frames up the phases of progress within that target. And so understanding that helps us to think through lots of different pieces. And this is where we wanted to go with the rest of this podcast episode, to kind of frame up that's what we think of when we're thinking of the idea of target and being focused on a specific segment, is that piece. But then in order to engage that, we've got to understand the phase that we're in, and how do you help a team to identify that phase, identify what they should be focused on, and then also to think about, where are the gaps? Where is there no adoption yet? Or where is there adoption, but it's not moved beyond that? And so maybe we could talk around those two conversations and look at this tool here in a second. So I know you mentioned, Dave, just there in Oklahoma City, and I've experienced that here as well. And I think that's just kind of a across the board, that idea of focus, not only focus at the level of like what target segment are we on, but also focus in terms of what are the specific highest value activities for that phase that will get us to the next phase. That's a pretty critical conversation. You want to talk around that piece for a minute?
So we're going to go back to the beginning of the conversation where you launched us off, where it really is important that we begin with the end in mind. And so if our goal is to say, okay, we want to move these people from unreached to reached, we have to define that. What does reached mean for us? And I think there's a lot of debate. And what's most important about that is that your team understands what they're moving towards, right? And we're saying very openly that we want to have a local church that's indigenous led, with leaders that are multiplying. And so in terms of work here in Oklahoma City, when can we say, hey, that group is reached? Well, whenever they've got a local indigenous led church, for us, that's going to be a place where we can go, okay, now we're talking about this segment, this area in our geographic region being someone that's reached. Now, That doesn't mean we can just leave them behind and be like, whoop, all done, we're moving on, because there's so many of their same segment populations around the world, diaspora peoples especially, that are not yet reached in their urban context, which means we've got to push and see how they go forward in that. But with that being said, I think the phases that we're working through and casting vision for those things helps people know where they can jump in and begin to contribute. I think that's the biggest barrier to focus, is for people to go, okay, either A, they're overwhelmed because they're like, nothing's happening, where do I even begin? Or B, they get involved and then they realize that other people are already involved there, and then they say, well, am I just getting in the way, or should I try to take charge, or should I do something different? And then there comes this conflict where it's really a question of, how do I contribute? And these phases and understanding what the high value activities are in each phase is a great way for us to communicate anywhere who's leading or who God has put on our heart to focus on a particular segment. It's a great way for us to vision cast with people to say, if you want to contribute, here's how. And it may be a one-time simple step, or it may be a full, I'm going to join the team and get going. But that barrier of how do I get involved is broken when we start to say, here are the top 3 things that we're doing right now. And let's jump in with your practical example. Pick a phase, pick a group, talk about what high value activities would look like in that, where somebody go, this is how I know to contribute.
Yeah. And so this spreadsheet that I'll put up on the screen here just came out of that, of a need to say, what does that look like? And then also, as we're working with local partners who are just trying to understand, so what are you talking about? What are you trying to move towards? We needed to have something practical. And so the 5 phases, or the 7 phases, sorry, and a 5x5, it's really helpful to say, which phase are we in? So you said, give an example. So as we're working here among South Asians, that there's been adoption. Before we got here, there was adoption, gospeling, believers, and moving towards multiple now local churches that have a multiplying strategy within them. And so using this tracking tool that you see on your screen, and we'll put in the show notes for those listening, but you can track which phase that you're in and see it. But what's then helpful to me is not only do you see which one you're in, but you see the phases that follow that. So what that does for that emerging team or team that's already formed is to say, where are we in those phases? And then it's pushing towards the next phase. And so that's what's always really helpful for me in raising up leaders and helping them to understand, like you said, Dave, the contribution piece to the work is you've got to be able to cast vision for where we're going, but then also where we are now and what will get us to the next phase without being too spread out. If you talk about too many different things and too many activities, you lose your impact and you lose the forward momentum to get to the next phase. So being able to say, we're in the church phase and we're moving towards a reproducing church phase says there's some specific things that are going to help us move to the next phase. And when I see that, I immediately think of, well, to get from church to reproducing church, that takes leaders. And so if you're going to be able to get this church to actually reproduce, or a couple of churches to move from one church to them actually reproducing another church, you need to have the right kind of leaders. So we need to be focusing on controllable. What does a leader look like? Who are we looking for in terms of that leader? And then do we have clarity of the process through which we're raising up that leader and training them to plant another church? So this is where we've talked about a lot about the lost to leader pathway. And for me, the reason why I talk about that pretty often is because I think we know how to get to church in a lot of our contexts here in the West in some way, shape, or form. And I'm not even discounting the fact that there are some indigenous churches that may not have a multiplying strategy yet. And we value that. We celebrate that even within people groups, there's maybe a church that doesn't have a vision for multiplication, but man, that's awesome that there is a church within that target segment. But in order to accomplish the sustained gospel presence and be faithful to the task, we're going to need to multiply that. We're going to need to see some way for that to multiply. And that's where the conversation around a lost to leader pathway. Do we have leaders that we can begin to identify? First of all, what is that leader? And then do we know how we're going to help that leader understand and be empowered to take what they've learned in this church and multiply it to another church. So just that's a lot of information, but that's a way of saying, hey, that tells us the phase that we're in within that target that we're targeting, that people group. And now we begin to dial into, okay, if we're in that phase, what are the things that we can do so that we can then begin to track the uncontrollables, which is going to be that church, actually people coming to it and it actually forming and identifying as church. There's some things that leader can do, but ultimately that's going to be the Lord working in these people and people coming to faith that we're going to populate that church and be a part of that church and be disciples in that church. That's going to be God, but there's things that we can do. And so that begins to help us as leaders and team leaders to say, here's what we need to focus on, guys. Let's not focus on these other pieces. And maybe in another phase where it's adoption, we're like exclusively focusing on gospeling. We're still gospeling and we still want to track that as we're in this church phase. But our emphasis and what we're focusing on is going to shift a little bit in terms of what we put our time to. So that's a starting point of just saying how this is useful for helping to lead a team within a city. So this tool is going to be helpful for an individual, but it's going to be even more helpful once you start to talk about raising up teams. And then as you start to have a network of networks in a city, being able to get on the same page with where the gaps are and where the next steps are in engagement is important. And this helps to facilitate that.
One of the ways we've been using this in Oklahoma City is to provide, we're using a Canva template that puts these colors like you're seeing on the screen. And then someone looks and they're going, okay, I see that let's people group 1 has, all the way up to church, but then I see the gray next to people group 2 and they come and well, what does the gray mean? Well, the gray means that we don't have anybody who's even, as far as we know, that's adopted that people group. And so then somebody could come back to me and they could say, well, how could we help with that? Well, okay, it's a great way to do that. And so then, hey, you want to figure out what you want to do with this particular people group, and I want to do adoption. A real easy communication of what are the high value activities or the rhythms that need to be involved if we were to go all the way back to adoption, to take what you were saying with church, bring it all the way back to beginning. I'd say something simple like this. I want you to go and do some internet research on the people group. I want you to figure out what's their main religion, what's their main language, and what's their main geographic area that they live in our city. The second thing I want you to do is I want you to go to those geographic areas and I want you to begin a prayer walk. And I would train them in a very simple prayer walking strategy that they could prayer walk over the course of a month. And then the third thing I would ask them to do is I would say, I want you to set a goal on how many conversations, cultural conversations you have with someone of that people group where you're learning, like we learned from Bud Houston, right? We're learning about them, we're learning from them, and then we're learning with them, and then walking them through how to do that. Those would be my lead measures. Those are the controllables. The lag that I would say is, okay, here's what I want you to track to see if you're moving into, and how do we move from adoption into the gospeling phase? And I'd say, okay, great. How many gospel conversations have come out of those interviews with people as you're just learning from the people? How many gospel conversations have come out of them? And if a gospel conversation happened, when did it happen? And on what questions and on what topics were you discussing that led into the gospel really well? So that then that team can start thinking about, okay, here's the ways in which we can connect with this culture to begin to gospel among them really well. And then they can turn around and start training other seed sowers in those things that they've learned because they went out, adopted the group, became the expert in their field, and did the research and the street work to actually learn who are these people, where do they live, how do they think, what do they like, and then going, how do we apply the gospel to that? So it's a very simple thing to go, okay, now we can click the adoption box and we know people group 2 has somebody that's adopted. And then if someone comes and says, well, who's adopted them? Well, X church over here, or this particular team, I'd love to talk with them. Okay, then someone says, well, I want to help with that. And then they go to a church or a particular team that's adopted that group and they go, how can I help? Well, if that group knows internet research, prayer walking, and basically cultural interviews is what we're doing right now in the adoption phase, then when someone says, how can I help? come prayer walk with me, come
That's
do
right.
some cultural engagement surveys with me, and then let me send you out to some areas we haven't been to yet because we're still wanting to know about more geographic regions in our cities. And automatically they have a way to bring people in to begin to experience one time, two times, or for a season how to help with that team and that work. And I'm thinking, Mark, that this vision cast is a great way to fold people into the work because it removes the barrier of how do I contribute?
Yeah. Yeah. How do I contribute? And then where are we going to? I know you talked about, Dave, just as you are using this a little bit there in Oklahoma, and the idea of the phases is not coming from us. There's others that have come up with this, and this is a way to collaborate. But what I've just been talking about with people is gaps remain gaps when people are not talking about them, when people don't have language to talk about them, or it's not even a part of their conversation. And so part of why this is so helpful is because it begins to shine a light on where the gap is and what we're defining as our goal and target for engaging that gap. So I know for you, you've also, as you've talked about using this, Dave, you talked about, hey, we put this in front of people and they're like, so why reproducing church? Why multiplying church? Can you talk about that a little bit, about how the tool can be used in that way too?
The big 4 reasons why I really like this vision cast tool is because it folds in 4 really good concepts into one simple visual that someone can look at real fast, see it and understand it, and it casts vision for what we're about at the specifics. And those 4 big things are, one is we have priority people groups where we're saying these are our gaps. These are the gaps that we're after, and we want help with that. We're saying, look, we can't do this alone. We want help with that. The second thing that it communicates very quickly and very well is our end goal is multiplying indigenous churches.
Yes.
Right. That's what we're after. And so that sends a signal to people who might be interested in helping with us, what we're about, what our focus is, and where our priorities lie. The third thing that it really helps with is it shows people where we are. And so they can say, oh, there's work being done. And they can respond to that in one of 2 big ways. One is they can say, hey, I know of things you don't know about. Great. Let us know, because we're always in research phase. We're always wanting to learn what we don't know about so that we can collaborate among people in our city. Or their response can be, I didn't know that anything was going on there themselves. And they're excited to learn that what they have on their heart, what the Lord's already done, that they now have found their people in their tribe, and they can begin to have partners with the gospel. And the fourth thing that I really, really, really love, it is a high value or a high altitude tracking piece that lets people know that there's progress that's happening. And so the details sometimes of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when you're tracking, just cause people to kind of glaze over if they don't understand the details of what goes on. And whenever we're using this in a mid-level group where we're saying, okay, take 10 minutes, tell us the phase that you're in, tell us the work that's going on in terms of what you're tracking with your high value activities, tell us how your lag measures are, the uncontrollables about what God is doing, and then share an anecdotal story with us about what's happening in the harvest field that explains to us where you are. And then let us pray for you as a team. And what we're watching is that in 10 minutes, somebody can look at the 7 phases and they can say, okay, I know what they're about, where they're working, what their high value activities are, and what segment of population that they're going after. And those 4 things can be communicated very, very quickly. And if someone is interested, it gives them a platform to go and say, I want more detailed information so that they can become more specific, more accurate. Now, once you get past all of these simple little 7 colored bubbles that you created, there's a lot of details. There's a lot of training. There's a lot of learning. There's a lot of research that's going to have to go into that. But it doesn't overwhelm people, and they can really get a hold of that. And more than anything, as a vision cast, it's easy to digest quickly. And then ask pertinent questions about the most important things.
You and I have talked about this, that if we're going to mobilize team of teams, we're going to have clarity of target, have some tracking around that, which is what this tool does. And then teams are going to form around that. And so the goal here, to bring it back to those T's and that big picture, is that we would make sure that we're focused on, like you said, not so many targets that we don't that we're taking, we actually become the bottleneck to progress. So we've got to be focused enough that we can actually steward what we're engaging, and but then have enough level of clarity around where we are that other people can contribute and join in it. So I think what you just said is the application of that, how that then can be brought into a problem solving retreat or rhythms of problem solving. You're talking about a specific set aside time for mid-level, but we're going to use this here in New York here next week, actually, as we come together as team that we have monthly rhythm that will come together and use this as a way to collaborate, to learn from one another, because then it begin to say, what phase are you in? And not only can it communicate to others, like you were talking about, we can say, hey, you got to reproducing church among that target. What did that look like? How did you work with those leaders to get to that point? And then we can actually have a high level starting point for saying, not only how can we collaborate, but how can we learn from one another and see where there are breakthroughs and wins that teams have gotten that we need to learn from.
Yeah. And the other thing that I didn't expect that I really have enjoyed about it is sometimes whenever you get together with a group of leaders and our end goal is to see a multiplying movement of reproducing churches, you find that in tracking that the most important thing is who has the most churches or most disciples in the room, and anybody who's below that at that point feels like they don't have anything to contribute because they don't measure up.
Yeah.
And one of the most difficult things to do is if you've been in this long enough, you've gone through some of it, and then if you went and tried to go after another target, you found that you restarted and went all the way back to the beginning. And if you show up at a mid-level or retreat or a group of leaders or a community of practice or even anywhere where the conversation is happening, you have a tendency to do one of two things: either feel like A, you don't measure up, or B, you lie about the work that's going on so that you can show that everybody that you do measure up. And so one of the things I love about the phases is it says, we don't need you to be at a certain level on the phases. What we need for you to do is you need to tell us, where does God have you in the work, whether that be you just started or you're in the middle of it or you've been at it for a little while and God has seen some multiplication take place. The beauty of this is it says we're not interested in who has the most churches. We're interested in, are the gaps reached? Yes. And so what matters is, how are you doing in the work, in the phase that you're in? Because that is the priority for you in order for us to get to that gap and the next gap and the next gap and the next gap. And so it has unintentionally, but thankfully has provided a way for someone who is in the adoption phase to have a legitimate reason to share what's going on and how they're doing. And it allows the community to then have a perspective that just says to them, man, that is awesome. We know exactly where you are. We're thankful for the work, and we can celebrate where they are, not where they aren't. And I think if we can get to the place where, as a community of practice, we can celebrate where people are and have the joy of the season that they're in, instead of them feeling guilty for not being in a season that they aren't, the whole community can just thrive. And it removes some of the barriers of jealousy. It won't always remove all of them, but it is a way for us to pull out jealousy from the tracking conversation.
So we've got to be able to have, this is something that I think we just come back to again, and we've got these themes that we talk about on this podcast, but we've got to have a value for collaboration and a value for team, but then we've also got to have pathways and practical ways to facilitate that actually happening. And so I think when you and I get together, Dave's like, here's the value, here's why this matters, and I'm like, cool, here's some practical things that I've just struggled through to try to understand how to actually do that. And so I feel
which is why we have this tool, because you created it to come up with a practical way, and it's been very helpful.
Yeah. And so I think even just that, and Dave and I working together to collaborate, hopefully that's just even a model and example to you all of, I don't feel like I've got all the pieces. I need Dave to help me to think through this as a system, and I'm doing it and I'm learning and I understand on some level, but I think you got it way better understanding than I do. So, but then being able to come with a practical piece, I think that even just is a model. Hopefully you all can hear that and see that, and an example of what that's got to look like in our cities and even in our targets that we're talking about within a city right now. But I always like the analogy of the pancake stack, that when we're thinking about engaging geography and people groups within that, that's like a stack of pancakes. Each of those pancakes is a segment, is a people group, a target. And then that pancake not only is within that city, that there's people and different geographies. You could go down into the pancake stack at any point and you're going to find different, but that's also extends over to across North America to other cities. And so finding a way to communicate value for this is one thing. And I think we're at that point in North America. We'll talk to you guys here in a minute. There's about this upcoming conference to try to begin to collaborate this fall around engaging unreached peoples for North America. So we've got a conversation that's really starting to stir up around the value for it. But we've got to have practical pathways like this kind of thing. I'm not saying this is the silver bullet. We've got to have ways to actually make space to learn from one another and to take those hot coals where it's like saying, hey, oh, this is happening in Nashville, or whoa, that's happening in Philly, or what? Wow, that's amazing. How do we begin to learn from one another? And I think whether it's this tool or another one, I guess I just want to put out there to some people that maybe are listening, even from other cities and other places, this is a pathway to collaboration, is these phases, being able to say, what phase are you in whatever geography or city that you're in, and so that we can begin to say, how do we learn from that? You've gotten to multiplying church, or you've gotten to a church. Right now it's like in a lot of places, like we have, how do we get to church? How do we get to that foothold of church within that target people group in that location? And we can learn from one another around that. So I think there's a lot of levels to a tool like this. And we're flying fast through all of it. But the point being, I think some of the best tools in doing this kind of work have a micro to macro piece, because we've got to get to the end state of sustained gospel presence, but we've got to be able to help people get started and celebrate that they're starting as well.
Let's say you're in the adoption phase, right? You're going to do research, you're going to do prayer walking in the geographic regions where you find them, and you're going to do interviews of people who are in that culture to learn from them. Well, then you go to the gospeling phase, and you're going to say, our high value activities, our rhythms, our weekly rhythms are, we're going to be prayer walking. We're going to be sharing the gospel with people who are there. And then we want to be in prayer so many hours a day, let's say, as a team to do that gospeling phase. And then we're going to be tracking how many gospel shares were made, how many baptisms are we up to, and then you can start tracking, do we have any discovery groups? Because as discovery groups will help lead you to the next phase, where we're going to go, okay, not only do we have believers, but are we starting to see some gatherings of churches? So then you go, okay, what do we do for DBS? We're tracking how many DBSs do we have? And the beauty of these phases is that something that was uncontrollable in the phase before now becomes something that you're tracking as the controllables that you're working at.
Yeah.
Because now God has moved you to the next phase, and he's saying, I want you to be faithful and responsible with the things that I've entrusted to you. Before, you didn't have them, and they had to be something that was supernaturally created by me. But now that they've been supernaturally created, I'm giving you an entrusting responsibility to you. So then we need to track our responsibility so that we can then see God do the next piece of the phase. And honestly, Mark, I really believe that some people will go, that's not spiritual enough. It's too pragmatic. But I would say it in this way. We're not saying that you can force any of these phases. These are all going to be a movement of the Spirit of God. The classic illustration, we have to raise our sails and wait for the Holy Spirit to blow. But once we've been entrusted with the responsibility of a phase that we're in, it's up to us to control whether or not we're responsible for those things. And so we have to make sure that we're doing that work and then expecting God and behaving in such a way that we have faith that God is going to take us to the next work. And that pathway that you've created with this tool, I think, is one of the most helpful pieces to give people. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I'll go back to it to say, here's the high level view of where we are with the unreached peoples. Here's the gaps, and here's the work that's happening in the gaps to move from unreached to reached in our cities. And here are the phases that each of those are in, and here are the high value activities that are happening, so you know how to jump in and contribute. And the beauty of it is, even if someone doesn't necessarily use the model or methods that we have, we can still celebrate and know that work is going on among one of the gaps because somebody's moving towards church. Even though they may not be, quote unquote, with us, we can still celebrate what God is doing in a city and let people know, here's the areas that are the greatest need and the highest priority. And that's the key for us. Where is the gospel not? And that's what we're wanting to communicate the most.
I think you hit on something in there, Dave, that I've actually, as I've gotten around some circles as we're connecting here in New York City and just up in the Northeast, I think there's always some nuggets in truth when people throw critiques out, and so I want to have ears to hear. But around, there's just been a lot around trying to make something happen or trying to control this process. And so you mentioned a lot of things in that like that what you were sharing there, but that piece around stewardship, and you use that language a lot. I feel like it's such a helpful way to frame this up. And I think as those that are trying to respond to God's vision and call to see every nation, every people have the gospel shared among them, and then the end will come. There's a stewardship to that I think you can fall in one of those two ditches of either God's doing this or we're doing this. And I like the way that you talked about that, because this tool is in some way a way of us tracking what God is doing. But then you just made that really important point that I don't feel like I've heard you say before, and I just wanted to highlight it, that after God has done it, because he's the one who's going to have to work the gospel in the heart of that person and bring someone into the kingdom. Our mouth to ear gospel is going to be our side of the street, but then God's going to have to work. But after that happens, I like that you mentioned that there's a stewardship on our end of things with what God just did as we go into the next phase. I don't think I've heard you talk about that before. That was really key, that there's just a tension there. There's the word again, is that God is doing this work, but we've got to be good stewards of it. And so that's a good way to respond as people are saying, are you just trying to make all these things happen? No, we're trusting God, but we want to be good stewards of what God is doing. And so this way of talking about the phases is our attempt to say, how do we be good stewards of the task to steward those gaps and the process and the progress of what God is doing in the process of it.
So I'll give a real practical example of that. Let's go back. We'll just use Gujarat since we brought it up before. To move somebody in the adoption phase, I can't get somebody to have a heart for Gujaratis. Only God can do that. But when God gives someone that heart, they're now responsible to do something with that call. So the adoption phase is God moves them into the adoption phase by saying, hey, pay attention over here. And he does something supernatural in their heart. Yeah. And then once he does it, the adoption phase requires them to react, to respond in obedience, and to be responsible for what he's called them to. And then as they're doing that, then they figure out how to share the gospel. They begin gospeling. And whenever God sees a Gujarat come to Christ, then he's now entrusted that disciple to them. And their job is to disciple that person. And then once that person is discipled, they will have other people that are coming into the kingdom, and then God's going to entrust a church. And when that church is birthed, you can't create it. But when it's birthed, you better be dang sure that you're responsible for it, right? So that's the Oklahoma term for pay attention, right? So now I'm responsible for that church. And then once that church has a leader that raises up, and God's entrusted that leader to you, you better make sure that you spend time with that leader. But each of those things are not something you can create, right? But you are responsible for, entrusted to, responsible to steward that. And there's a big difference between ownership and stewardship. And once you start to think you own that, that's wrong-headed. God owns it, but we are responsible to steward that.
Man, I think there's a whole other podcast episode right there. We'll have to
we get together every week and we'll do it. Hopefully this has been helpful to people who were listening in. Mark and I are just tossing out contributions. Mark said multiple times, this may not be the silver bullet. We can guarantee you that what we're talking about is not the silver bullet. What we are saying is that tracking, getting to the gaps and going where the gospel is the most important thing. And so our hope, as always, is that we're just tossing this out to you guys as a church. And if someone comes up with a better way of doing this, and this sparks an idea that makes them go, this is even better way of doing this, then by all means, run with it, make it better, and do this, because the whole point of contributing is for the kingdom to be able to share with one another so that we can all get better at what we're doing.
That's right. So guys, we want to be good stewards of what God's doing, and it's going to take collaboration. And so this fall, Dave talked about this on a recent episode here, and bring that up again, September 28 to 30 for an Unreached Peoples 2023 conference. You can find that at unreachedpeoples2023.com, all the information. And the goal is that you could come, and if you're feeling stuck, for example, in where you're at in these phases, or maybe you've got a a heart that has God's begun to put on your heart, like Dave's talking about, a heart for a people group. But how do I even get started? What do I even do? Those different pieces are why we need to come together and be good stewards of who God is burdening in their heart, and help them get to the next phase. Or if you're stuck and you just need to find out who else is out there or discouraged, we need to come together and collaborate around that. So come join us this fall.
What's the website again, Mark?
unreachedpeoples2023.com.
We'd love to see you guys there.
All right. Thanks, guys. We will see you next time.
Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.